Okay. Thanks to everyone for coming. This is a panel seminar titled Explorations in E-Science, Applications in the Social Sciences and Humanities. My name's Rado Lentz. I'm an associate professor in international relations, but I'm also the coordinator of the MA program in the field of e-science. Part of my motivation as the coordinator of the program in setting up this panel seminar was to try to answer the question, what is e-science? And even more difficult, what is e-science for the social sciences and humanities? And my old creative writing lecturer used to always say it's better to show it than to tell it. So I'll try to tell you a little bit about what it's about, but I thought it would be better and you'd get a clearer understanding of what we're doing if you actually got a chance to see some of the work that people involved in the program are doing. The telling it part is that e-science is a field that kind of straddles two big and interrelated changes that have been happening in the world over the past decade plus. One being the advances in computing technology and computing capacity, and the other being the increasing availability of data, or maybe what I should say, the increasing availability of information that can be converted into structured data. So that's where the two things link up. We're now able to do a lot of things with information that we weren't able to do previously. The MA program in the field of e-science is an innovative one in a bunch of ways. Definitely the first of its kind in South Africa. And a few things about it, and you can ask questions at the end after you've seen the presentations. Maybe you'll have a better idea of what it's about. But the first is that it's interdisciplinary. So we take applications from anyone who's done at least honors level study in social sciences or humanities. It is a research program, so it's about doing research in the social science and humanities. If you want to be using computers to create artwork or something like that, then, I mean, we think some of our graphs are pretty nice, but there's digital arts and other fields for that. But what we focus on is interdisciplinary research that uses essentially statistical computing and what's now come to be known as data science. We're more on the applied side of data science, so we're taking all these new techniques that are available, that are emerging in the field of data science and applying them to research questions across the social sciences and humanities. You'll see some examples of some of these in the panel today. Rita, who will be presenting on the land debate in South Africa, is using text mining, which is a new kind of data science approach to analyzing text statistically. Lauren and myself use a bit of GIS, which is spatial data, where it's been around for a long time, but the kinds of things we can do with data where social data is not only is spatially referenced, so we can say not only, for example, in a survey, do we have a household that's in Gauteng and it's in Johannesburg, but we can actually get geographical coordinates of at least the neighborhood within which the data comes from. So that's spatial data, GIS, and text mining are some of the kind of special topics in applied data science that we look at. The idea of the program is that it's supposed to complement your previous expertise if you're a postgraduate student, not that you just sort of drop everything you've ever done and start something new. So really what we're trying to do is take postgraduate students who have expertise in one or more substantive fields and then to kind of add the capacity to do the data analysis on top of that. So for example, it's a coursework in MA research reports program, so when you're looking to write an MA research report, we actually encourage people to find co-supervisors or supervisors who are in the field which they've studied previously. So it's not doing something at the expense of what you already know. Another thing that's innovative about the program is that it partially overlaps with an MSc program in the field of e-science. And the MSc program is drawing people more from the computer science, stats, math, applied math, engineering fields. And out of the 3 courses that you take that you would take as a master's student, 1/3 of them are overlapping with the MSc students. So it gives a kind of mutual awareness between the people on the science side of campus and on this side of campus, the kinds of collaborative work that can happen when you know something about e-science from the social science side versus the more technical people coming from the other side. So you're not going to, the idea is not to turn you into a computer science graduate, it's to give you the skills to collaborate and communicate and work on teams with people who come from that background. So that's the big picture. The other thing about the courses, which I'm currently teaching the 2 semester-long compulsory courses on the social science humanities side, those are in fact open to anyone in this who's doing a master's or above in the social sciences and humanities, whether or not you're in the e-science program. So basically you would need my permission, which I would generally give. I mean, if you're crazy enough to take the course, I'm crazy enough to take you, but you would need the permission from your home master's program to say this is something that we will accept as one of your credits towards your master's degree. So the courses are open even beyond the e-science program. A few nuts and bolts about the program. One that, and this is important for any postgrad student interested in it, is that it's funded by the South African Department of Science and Innovation, and there are lucrative bursaries available for it. That's the good part about it. The thing that goes along with that is that actually admission is competitive because there's a limited number of bursaries and people are competing for those bursaries. So I can't say if you have a 68 average or if you have a 70 average in your home discipline that you're guaranteed you're going to get in. It's going to depend on the competition for those bursaries from across different fields. There's still time to apply for this year. I think I should have double checked on this. I think that the initial application deadline, I don't know, Helen, do you know, it was, I think it was end of September. It's possible that it was end of October, but I'm going to ask them to extend, to continue to accept applications at least through October. Although it's always better if you're competing for bursaries to get your application in sooner rather than later, because once we make provisional acceptances, it's just that many fewer bursaries that are available. So after we're done, we've got people on the panel, several people who in the room. Maybe raise your hand if you're actually an e-science student. Okay, we're in the second, kind of an e-science. So we've got people around the table who can give you a student's perspective on what it's about if you've got questions, and I can answer questions as the coordinator. Okay, so we'll come back to that at the end, and I'll, at the end of my presentation is the last one. So at the very last slide of my presentation, I'll put some links to websites up on the screen in case you want to read more about the program. All right, I think what I'll do is just give quick introductions to each of the speakers as we go through the panel. I think there'll be short presentations. We all know we're presenting to an interdisciplinary audience, so we're really talking more about our research than making a formal presentation of our research findings. Then once we've gone through all the presentations, we'll take questions and comments for all of them. Each one will be about 10 to 15 minutes. That's what we're shooting for. So our first presentation will be from Rita Lange, a very topical presentation exploring the land question, text mining the Dubula Ubunu witness testimonies. If you don't speak isiZulu, it's the Kill the Boer case. Rita, take it over here.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I don't know if I ever told Rod this, but the reason how I actually found out about the eScience program is I was either checking how long they could possibly take to mark your thesis, or I was late with my library books. And there was this blue pop-up on the BITS website, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do last year. So that's actually how I found eScience. So I'm really glad that there's a forum for students that are interested to find out a bit more and to ask questions. So my topic today, and I'm going to, as Rod said, speak more about my research, then actually take you into an in-depth look into it, is looking at the land question, and it's using text mining to explore the Dabula Ibunu witness testimonies. So in terms of today, I'm just going to tell you a bit about myself, just to say that basically anyone can do eScience, take you through my research journey and a bit about my findings, talk a bit about why you can do research in this way and what's the benefits of that, and then just broadly the value of these types of skills. So firstly, just about myself, and this is not to say that I have an interesting life. I have a pretty boring existence. But I have a background in journalism, so I studied journalism and also worked in journalism, but I've always really loved history, so I did my honours here in history and then went on to do my PhD in heritage, where I looked at struggle songs. So the point I just want to make is you don't need to be someone that took computer science at school or sits every weekend in codes or does statistics courses on Coursera. If you've got an open mindset and you're willing to learn and you're initially willing to really feel like it's a foreign language and you're completely lost, you'll be fine. But eventually there will be an aha moment when your code actually works and you're like, this is like a miracle, this is magic. So just to say, like I say, everyone can do it if you've got the right attitude to it. Specifically now about my research. So I explored the land issue, and I did this by looking at court documents, specifically witness testimonies from a court case that took place in 2011. It was when AfriForum took Julius Malema, who was still president of the Youth League at that stage, to court over him singing the song that was called the Bula Ibunu, or Shoot the Boer, in the media. The trial took place here in Joburg in April 2011. ANC joined the case as well. They had the same legal team as Malema, and on the other side you had AfriForum and Transvaal Agricultural Union of South Africa, but those two had different legal teams. So in terms of my research question and what I really wanted to find out, I wanted to look at the land question, the significance that the different individuals and organizations within this case attached to it, the way that they deployed it within the court case and the ideas and emotions around that and how they used that to strengthen their arguments in court. I wanted to look at how issues around land reform intersects with ideas around reconciliation and transformation in post-apartheid South Africa. But ultimately, it was really about answering this question. How did the different organizations and witnesses in the case deploy the land issue in court? And as I mentioned, I did heritage beforehand. And I'll be honest, I was quite skeptical about this computer thing. I was like, is it really going to be able to add anything? I'd actually looked at these documents in quite a lot of detail in my PhD. It was one of my chapters, so I really felt that I knew them back to front. So I was really like, is this really going to do anything? Is it going to add anything? So this was kind of a personal research challenge for myself to see if using a different method would add anything, would show me anything new. And I'll answer this at the end, whether I think computers are okay, whether I'm okay with that. So the method I used was text mining. And text mining, you get a lot of definitions about it, but essentially it's around using techniques from computer science, from statistics, from linguistics to look at textual data. And it helps researchers to find patterns, relationships, connections that might be missed by the human eye. So it's quite an innovative and novel research approach in that regard. Then just a little bit about my research methodology. As I mentioned, I won't go into too much detail. I essentially looked at three themes, which was land reform, reconciliation, which is really the ideology of reconciliation, very much associated with former President Nelson Mandela, things like the Rainbow Nation, and this statue really represents it quite well in terms of that ideology. And on the right, it's around transformation, and this we've seen emerge really strongly since the trial in 2011, and we saw it during Fees Must Fall, during Rose Must Fall, this questioning of reconciliation, of the validity of the idea of the Rainbow Nation, and a call for more justice. Then in terms of the choices I made, So firstly, I did a bag of words approach, and that sounds fancy, but initially, basically it's just treating every word as a single token. So you don't look at word order, you just look at the frequency in terms of certain words appearing in your text. I did a dictionary, so I did that manually, so I didn't use sort of an existing dictionary. I myself looked at the 3 different themes and chose specific words that reflected those themes. And then the third thing that I did was around sentiment analysis, and that was looking at the emotion that was found in the testimonies. And for that, I used existing lexicons that essentially have a lot of English words and assign scores for either positive and negative sentiment. In terms of the dictionary and the keywords, so you'll see the full list of keywords in a later slide, but it was words, for example, in terms of reconciliation, words like Mandela, constitution, redress. Under transformation, it was words like freedom, revolution, nationalization. And land, I kind of split it up to look at words that reflected sort of more the formalized agricultural sector, so words like farm and farmer, and then other words that were more closely tied to land reform, for example, a word like compensation. In terms of the testimonies, so there were 11 witnesses in total. AfriForum had 2, Tau SA had 4, and the ANC had 5. They really brought quite a lot of the heavy hitters. So Gwedi Mantashe was there, the SG at that stage, Derek Hanekom, who was a deputy minister, and which was quite interesting because he was sort of their token Afrikaner. So he was meant to counter the idea that AfriForum represents all Afrikaans-speaking people. Colin Shabane was a minister in the presidency, Julius himself, and who am I missing? Oh, Prof. Mongani Wali Sorote, who's a poet and former CEO of Freedom Park. So that's just to give you a sense of my research methodology. Just a little bit about the results. So land was the dominant cluster in terms of the 3 clusters, and the land kind of terms appeared 335 times, followed by the reconciliation cluster and the transformation one. Those are the individual words, so you can see that words such as farmer, farm, land, dialogue, and freedom, those are kind of the top 5. For example, farmer appeared 126 times in the document, and a word like dialogue 66 times. If you then zoom into sort of the different parties, so AfriForum, they use 66 land terms, 38 reconciliation terms, and 3 transformation ones. Reconciliation they really use in quite an interesting way. So they tried to argue in court that the ANC had actually forsaken this ideal. So they were trying to say, but you've actually left reconciliation behind, because if you still followed that and if you still believed in that, you wouldn't be singing a song like this. They made the case that, for example, former President Mandela wouldn't have sung this kind of song at the 95 Rugby World Cup final. So they really tried to say, but you've left this ideal behind, and that's why they used reconciliation terms. If you zoom into the land cluster, you can see that their agricultural bucket is in the majority, so that's words such as agriculture, farm, and farmer. They only use the word land 11 times. The ANC also has a couple of interesting things. So firstly, you can see that reconciliation and transformation was incredibly close. Transformation, just a couple of words more. And I think this points towards the tension within the ruling party about how to deal with our past and how to deal with the legacy of that. And I think we've seen that emerge stronger since the trial, but you can already see that tension here. Land terms was also the dominant cluster. Again, the agricultural buckets, so agriculture, farm, and farmer dominates. And a lot of those words were either from Malema himself or from Derek Hanekom. They were asked about the lyrics of the song. They were asked about how farmers would feel about it. They were asked about the kill the boer, kill the farmer chant that was used by Peter Mokaba in the early 90s. And something that, I was not supposed to, okay, this was supposed to first be hidden because now it reveals itself, the table. So just ignore that. I had animation. But essentially it's around looking at Malema and sort of the other ANC witnesses. So as I mentioned, you had Gwedi Mantashe, you had Derek Hanekom, you had Wale Sorote, and you had Colin Shabane. So I thought it would be interesting to compare Malema to sort of those older ANC witnesses to see if there were any differences. And to do that, firstly, I normalized the testimony, so that was so that you could compare them in terms of the different lengths. So you actually take your frequencies and you take them to 10,000 occurrences in the text, so that I could then compare them. And then I created sort of an average ANC veteran witness and then compared that to Malema. So you can really see here that Malema is an outlier. The ANC veteran dominates in terms of reconciliation, and Malema in terms of transformation and land. And what's interesting here is that Malema at this stage in 2011 had experienced some of the disciplinary problems within the ruling party, but he was still president of the ANC Youth League at this stage. So it's interesting that he was already then starting to move away from the older ANC witnesses. So they were still clinging on to the idea of reconciliation, and he was starting to move away from that. About 10 months later, he would be expelled from the ANC, and of course, in 2013, he would form the EFF. And he's really kind of rebuilt his political brand pretty much based on land and the failure of reconciliation. So it's really interesting that you could already see that emerge in 2011. And then the last aspect of my results is just to show you a sentiment analysis, and sentiment analysis looks at emotion. So you essentially use existing lexicons that have thousands of English words, and it either gives you, and it gives different scores for positive or negative sentiment. So the testimonies were overwhelmingly negative. There was only one witness that had a positive score. The most or the lowest scores were Derek Hanekom, Malema, and Aaron's Roots from AfriForum. And these are some of the words that made the biggest contribution to either negative or positive sentiment. So on the negative side, you've got kill. That was used in various contexts. I've mentioned already the kill the boer, kill the farmer chant, also in terms of farm killings. And then on the positive side, you've got the word freedom. And what was interesting there, the only person that had positive sentiment was someone that testified on behalf of Tau SA. His name was Dani Goosen. He's from the Federation of Afrikaans Culture Organizations. He used the word freedom a lot to make a comparison between the struggle against apartheid and the South African war against the British. So that's where it becomes interesting to really know the documents and know what's actually going on in them in terms of interpreting. So what do I think now about the whole robot thing and whether computers are okay? Is I think that it did add value. There was a lot of things that I sort of suggested in my previous research. I'd already sort of seen and hinted that Malema was moving away, but I think this was another tool I had in my toolbox in terms of research to present another piece of evidence. So I think it was useful in terms of adding to the research that I had already done. Then just quickly in terms of why consider this research, I'm sure there are people that might be skeptical, and I think this really sums it up for me nicely, that it's a combination of the two things. So if you're doing a close reading, you get that really deep view, but if you're doing computational analysis, then you can get a kind of bird's eye approach that will reveal hidden patterns that you might not have seen with your human eye. And I think it's really important, though, that last part, to combine it with domain expertise. So if you just maybe did an analysis of these documents, but you didn't kind of know the context, you hadn't looked at them, you didn't kind of have any sense of the political or heritage environment, you certainly wouldn't be able to fully understand what your results are telling you. The value of such skills, just quickly, I think there's a lot of value in terms of equipping yourself with skills like this. I think firstly there's a lot of research opportunities. This is just one project as an example that's happening in the UK, where it's a 5-year, £9.2 million kind of research project that's going to look at the Industrial Revolution and pulling together people like historians, data scientists, curators. So I think if you have these kind of skills in your skill set, I think it just adds a lot in terms of the kind of options you have going forward, because there are going to be more and more projects that kind of take this approach and pull different people together. And lastly, I think we all hear about 4AR all the time, but I think that's really important, that if you have some experience in interdisciplinary collaboration, that will also set you up. So Prof. Osman, who at that stage was the Dean of Humanities, but she's now one of the Deputy Vice Chancellors, wrote this about sort of cross-disciplinary communities and said how important it's going to be. So she says, we'll need to do more when it comes to drawing on approaches from various disciplines, which will allow for quantitative reasoning, problem solving, and systems thinking that are socially relevant. So I think that's really important. And I wrote here also, the world needs bilinguals. That's not my term. I've seen it being used by MIT. But it's the sense of people that can understand both the tech, but also bring this kind of different kind of questioning, different kind of critical thinking that the humanities and the social science gives you. And if you actually have an understanding of both types of broader fields or both types of worlds, I think it will really set you up whether you are considering a career in academia or in industry. And that's it. I think we'll take questions at the end.
At the end. Okay. Thanks, Rita. Okay. Our next speaker is Palumi Oludokin. I don't have your title in front of me, but what she's doing is she's using machine learning algorithms to estimate HIV AIDS risk using DHS demographic and health survey data for South Africa. Pelumi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so just like Prof said, this presentation is just to give you an insight to what you can do in social science in terms of using data science methods. So it's nothing technical. So I wish I had this forum for when I was in my first year, because I had no idea what research I wanted to do. So the first years that are here, it's a big advantage for you to understand what research you can like go into. So just a little bit about me. I'm from Nigeria, and I heard about e-science when I was in Nigeria. I was almost giving up on doing my master's, so I'm really glad that I could get into the program. So I had no idea what e-science was, but it seemed like everyone was talking about using computer science, and it was like the new thing going on. So I came in blind, sort of. But with the help of Prof and a few of my colleagues, it was an easy transition into e-science. Or my background is in public health, so I had no idea what to do with programming or coding or software. I only knew a little bit of Starter, and I would say it's nothing compared to what we've done so far using R as a programming language. So like I said, it was shocking in the sense I didn't know what I was doing. I wanted to sort of merge public health and data science together, because most of my colleagues are from international relations, or like you said, Rita, she's from Heritage, right? Yeah, so I was the only one sort of like the sticking tongue out. So it was really hard to find a way to incorporate public health and e-science. But after so much deliberation, I found a way, and I chose to focus on HIV research. So for my capstone project, it was about exploring HIV expenditure in sub-Saharan Africa. I wanted to understand HIV expenditure in the region and the relationship between donor funds as well as domestic funds. So international funds to Africa reduced dramatically in 2010 after a steady growth of receiving donor funds from other countries. So I wanted to understand how African countries responded to that decline in funding. So did they increase the local funds available, or they just continue business as usual? Because we do need funding to achieve the 1990 goal by 2020. So I compiled my data set from UNAIDS and the World Bank Index, and the method I used was multivariate regression analysis using R. So my findings, I found that a few African countries such as South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Rwanda actually increased their domestic funds to supplement whatever we're getting from donor funds. Other countries either declined or just continued providing the usual funds. So the take-home message from that study was that Africa should take responsibility for its funding, for funding HIV projects to ensure sustainability and not relying on donor funds all the time. So for my main master's thesis, I wanted to go a little bit more technical. I wanted to use machine learning methods to predict HIV in women. So to focus the scope of my research, I focused only on women in South Africa because they carry the highest burden of the disease. So basically, I wanted to see if HIV can be predicted using non-clinical variables such as socio-demographic variables and behavioral factors like using condom, alcohol habits, and stuff like that. So if this was successful and we're able to predict HIV with high accuracy using machine learning methods, we can save money on resources, and we can only confirm diagnosis for those with high risk instead of just testing everybody randomly. So this could be really useful in low resource settings. I also thought that this research would be useful for researchers, especially in public health or social science, who are sort of in the dilemma of, do I abandon my traditional methods and go to data science that everyone is talking about, and what benefit would that add to whatever research they're working on? So that was the second objective of the research. So I'm not going into much details on my method section, but I found that, this is a decision tree. This is what I used, the method I used. From what I found, the accuracy of both methods highlighted in red there are really low. But the logistic regression did slightly higher than the decision tree, which is the major machine learning technique. So this shows that demographic data is not enough to actually accurately predict HIV, especially at the medical classification level. So I think that more variables could be needed to build the model to achieve higher accuracy, or we could just stick to the traditional methods of logistic regression and not bother about data science. But what I found was that the logistic regression had higher strength over the decision tree, because you could actually understand the relationship in terms of the strength using the coefficients. However, for a decision tree, it's more useful for in the medical setting for making accurate decisions. So you just build your model and you allow it make your decisions without actually understanding what's going on between the variables. So that is the advantage of a decision tree. But if you really want to understand the in-depth relationship between the variables, I would suggest to just use a traditional logistic regression. So that's really what I got from my research. So however easy it is to use a logistic regression, I would still advise for you to explore using machine learning techniques to understand your research in depth, because you don't really know what you can get. So I think that is the end of basically what I found from my research. So I would advise to take the e-science class because it will supplement on your existing skills and your existing knowledge in social science. Thank you.
It's a little bit different between heritage studies, where the traditional methods are almost exclusively qualitative, and public health, where when she's talking about conventional methods versus data science methods, she's talking about one statistical method versus another. So, okay. Good. Our third presentation is Lauren Vakranjes, who's going to talk about the impact of mining, local impact of mining in Africa. And I mentioned at the beginning, she's also using geographical data in her study. So she'll explain that to you. Thanks.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. So when deciding what to do for my research project, for my master's research only, I'm actually not part of the e-science program, but I do use the same methods. This was around the time where Marikana was in the news a lot, and I was wondering to myself, you know, we know that there's a lot of evidence that mining is good at a national level for your economy. I mean, this is basically built on mining. But how does it actually affect local communities? So I delved into the research, and there wasn't a lot. Everything was sort of on the fence. We don't really know. In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. And there was barely anything looking at it quantitatively. So I decided I would go with this method just because maybe by approaching this problem at a different angle, we'd be able to yield different new results. So why quantitative research? Well, my favorite thing is that you can replicate it, which I think gives your research a lot of credence. So if I find this incredible finding and a bunch of you replicate it, manage to replicate it, then we know there's something there. But if not, then it's sort of back to the drawing board. And I really appreciate the collaboration in that. You can increase the scope of what you can research. So if I had done this purely quantitatively, I might just do South Africa or a few local communities. But because I did this on this huge scale, I did over 500 communities in 19 countries with almost 5,000 people. So I mean, just the scope you can do at just a master's level is quite incredible. And you can also see trends over time. So I didn't do it for my research, but you could look at, say, 10 years and see how different policy implementations changed outcomes, which is quite cool. And you can use it, just as Rita showed you, to strengthen your qualitative research. And then, that's very important to say, you don't have to be good at maths, you don't have to be able to code. I mean, I'm not proud of this, but I got 40% in matric for maths, and I'm standing here now, so you can do it. You just have to be curious, have tenacity, and you'll do it. If anyone here is from a philosophy background, I really recommend it if you're good at logic, because it's like same WhatsApp group. So okay, so onto my methodology. What I wanted to do is I wanted to link mining data from the World Bank and Afrobarometer data, which is survey data that asks a bunch of questions to individuals across Africa. Both of these data sets had GPS coordinates. So what I did is I linked them so that if you were an individual around a mine within 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers, you were included in the sample. And I wanted to measure how the distance you are from a mine affects your living conditions outcomes. And so I had, if you were in an active mine, and if you were in a future mine, so a mine that is going to open in the future, and that was used as a control. And I also controlled for urbanization effects and country level effects. So the things I was questioning, living conditions, I divided it into 3 indexes. Development infrastructure, measuring the access to development infrastructure you have in your neighborhood, your access to household infrastructure, and lived poverty. I won't get into how I created those indexes, but these are sort of the questions I used to create an index from 0 to 1. Cool. So the reason I put this up here is I promised you before I started this was gibberish to me, but now I understand it. And if you take e-science, you will understand it too, which is quite cool. And it does really add a lot of insight. So here you can also just see the exact sample sizes. So 591 communities, and then 4,795 people who had data for household infrastructure, and 479 for lived poverty across 19 sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, so in quant research, one of the worst things that can happen to you, you think, would be a null results, which is basically here, as you can see, there's a mild trend, but nothing to write home about, which also I feel like reflects the literature where everyone was sort of on the fence about some people finding positive and negative results. But interestingly, when you look at it at country levels, there's quite a bit of variation. You see, like, if you just control for country, certain countries do a lot better. And that's the cool thing about e-science, is if you were doing it qualitatively just at one country, you might miss that there's a lot of variation going on in countries. So even though I didn't find any significant results, I did find something interesting. So you can see Botswana, which is known for having sort of good mining policies, is up there. I do need to say that this is ongoing research, so please don't draw any conclusions. Again, household infrastructure is the same sort of story. You can see over 100 kilometers versus your active in the future. And here, interestingly, it's that there's not much variation in country, but if you look up there, most of the positive scores, so that countries that did well, are urbanized countries and countries, communities in urban areas, which begs the question, does mining create urbanization and so it's actually good for local communities, or should we perhaps look at policies that could encourage mining in a different way? This again still needs to be investigated in terms of causation, but an interesting finding. Lived poverty, again, it doesn't seem like distance or mine makes much of a difference. And neither does urbanization, but the country that you're in does seem to make some sort of difference. And which is also, so I still have to investigate the mechanics of this, but again, it allowed me to look at the problem from a completely different angle, something that would not have been available to me if I had not been familiar with these methods. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. And I'll do the last presentation. Okay, so my presentation is titled Reinventing Election Observation Missions, or the jargon is EOMs. Election Observation is Social Science Research. And this is a report on an ongoing project that I'm working with Professor Ann Pitcher from the University of Michigan, as well as with the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, which is actually just down the road in near Melville. And they do election observation missions. So I'm working with Grant Masterson, who's a former Wits student on that side. And what we're trying to do with we're very lucky to have the cooperation of ISA in this exercise. So they're actually allowing themselves to be used in part as guinea pigs for our work, in which we're trying to advise them on better ways of doing election observation missions, and then they're actually implementing some of the suggestions. We can't tell them what to do, but when we give them a good argument, they seem to be willing to take it up. So this is a group photo from the mission in May for the South African election. You can see Denny Kadima is over on the right. I believe that's Goodluck Jonathan, the former Nigerian president. It's not his normal hat style. He's got an ISA cap on for this one. Right in the middle in the front is Knox Gwala, who's actually was a master's student in international relations at WITS, and she's kind of like the person who runs the election observation mission. She's kind of the right-hand woman, so she takes a lot of responsibility in that. I don't know how familiar you are with how election observation missions usually work, so I'll give you a quick summary of how they've been done in the past, and then try to brief you a little bit on the kinds of things that we've been doing to make them a little bit more scientific. So the typical kind of election observation mission, and I mean, I'm basing this largely on ISA, but I think it generalizes to the other big international observation organizations who do observations. One is that they try to get some national spread. If you're observing an election, you're looking for things like fraud and violence and intimidation are two of the main things that they're looking for. So what they've done traditionally is to deploy a fixed number of teams. Generally, a team that goes around on election day is 2 people with a driver, and they go around to visit voting stations and observe and fill in like a questionnaire on each station that they go to. The focus has tended to be on provincial capitals and then major cities and towns in each province. So, for example, if there's 10 provinces and 20 teams, which is not that uncommon, they'll try to send 2 teams to each province. Generally, one team will be based in the provincial capital, another one they'll probably find the second biggest town or city in the province and send a team out there, with the idea of trying to get a broad picture of what's happening in the country. And then the local selection, meaning once you've sent people, by the way, I mean, there's going to be logistics that go into this, and real cynics have sometimes referred to election observation missions as electoral tourism, that it's people who kind of want to come in and get a free ticket and stay in a nice hotel. There's definitely logistics considerations that go into where the observer teams are based, because you have to put them at least in a habitable hotel. So one of the things they do is they figure out where can we actually send people. And then once they've sent the teams out to these locations, they generally tell the teams they're expecting them to go to about 15 voting stations on election day. You can imagine that's a pretty big rush, because you're trying to observe things at each station, and you've only got about a half hour total between getting to the station and then doing the observation. And the traditional way of doing this has been to let each team select those stations. So they'll be staying in a town, and generally the instructions are, again, try to get some spread, do a few that are kind of in town where you're staying, but then make sure you go to some of the outlying areas that are nearby. Now, consequences over here for people who have sort of quantitative social science skills and know about sampling and things like that, just you imagine that this kind of way of doing things has certain consequences for the kind of data that you get. One of the consequences is that the logistics tends to drive the selection of the locations, both in terms of where you send observer teams and then which stations the teams choose to go to. I put convenient sampling. That's like, you know, the idea that you go where it's convenient. That may be a little bit harsh, because obviously there is an effort to spread people out over the country, and then for each team to kind of get some diversity in the kinds of places they go to, but none of this is systematic. So convenience will kick in terms of where are the hotels where we can send the observers, and then also that's going to factor into the kinds of stations that the teams go to. Numbers tend to dominate over distribution. Every election observation mission wants to impress everyone in their report by saying how many stations their observers visited. Now, I don't know how many postgrad research proposals I've seen that use convenience sampling that want to tell us how many interviews they can do if they go down to the Breed taxi rank with the questionnaires. You can get 2,000 questionnaires filled in quite quickly, but what does it tell you about anything in the country? It's really the numbers, people being obsessed with the numbers as opposed to thinking, what am I sampling from? What is the distribution of the observations? And as a result of those two things, the data are of little inferential value to researchers. And this was the kind of motivation for our whole project, is that you get these observer missions, they go in, they spend a lot of money, mostly donor money, as Pulumi saw with the AIDS programs, a lot of it donor money. You get a report, it's controversial possibly for 2 weeks, and then it goes on the shelf. No one ever looks at it again, and it's not really that much use to researchers. So we were trying to address that. The broad principles we were applying would be familiar if you know anything about social science sampling. In terms of national spread, instead of just starting out by figuring out where the hotels are, we decided to divide up the country based on provinces, and where possible within each province, between urban areas in the province and rural areas, we get a proportion of registered voters in each of those what are called strata. Each one's a stratum. And then we try to allocate observer teams proportionally to the share of the population. The sampling units we use at the first stage are administrative districts. So whether or not the administrative district, so this is the level below province, whether they have a hotel or not, we would still sample a district. If it turns out that there's a really extreme case where there's just no way that a team could get there, then we ask ISA to give us a documented reason why, confirmation that no, it's impossible for us to get someone there. I don't think we've actually had that problem yet. So even if they're based, they might be based in another town and have to drive 45 minutes to get to the district, but in most cases they've been able to do that. Local selection, this has been a major innovation, is to apply systematic clustering. So what we've had to do is define clusters of stations, about 15 stations per cluster within each of the districts that we've sampled. So once we've got the district, we know we're sending a team to the district. We divide the district up into these clusters of 15. Every voting station can be one and only one cluster, okay? Then once we've got the clusters, we sample randomly one cluster, and then we tell the observer team, here are your 15 stations that you're going to go to on election day, or 12, or whatever. So this is a big change for the observers who are used to being told it's their job to get a quote-unquote random sample or a diverse sample of stations. We're saying, no, we've chosen these stations. They're clustered so that you can get around to them relatively easily, but they have to go to the specific ones that they're assigned. The hardest part for this was defining the clusters, and I'm just quickly list the constraints. One is statistical, that each station can be in one and only one cluster. Second is a logistical constraint, that we need the clusters to be configured so that it's realistic for teams to get around to each cluster on election day. And then there is an institutional constraint, and this goes back to the fact that the organizations want to be able to say that they went to a lot of stations, is that we couldn't substantially reduce it. Now, we reduced it slightly. We said the clusters would be 15 in the metro areas, which is what they've always been. But because we're imposing a specific cluster on the observers, we said if it's a rural one, we'll take it down to 12, and they agreed to that. So it puts a little bit less pressure on them getting around. The big eScience challenge was to define and sample the clusters, so that's mainly what I'll focus on in these last couple slides. Using methods that, when I was a PhD student, I couldn't even imagine that I would be standing here saying that we were able to do this. So what we were able to do in South Africa, we actually had longitude-latitude coordinates for all 22,000 plus voting stations. And the first thing we did was to calculate a driving time matrix between all voting stations in the districts that we'd sampled. So, there were even districts where there were 1,000 voting stations in one district. In that case, you've got a matrix where you've got every district listed as a row, every station as a row, and every station as a column. And I don't know if you've seen those distance tables, then the cells inside are going to be the distance between any two points. So for the big ones, that could be actually 1 million cells, 1,000 by 1,000. I started by thinking, well, Google Maps does this kind of stuff. Maybe I can use the Google Maps API to get these matrices. Turned out they charged per cell, and that when you're running 1 million cells at a time, it was just not realistic, so I found another way to do it. Once we've got the driving time matrix, I used something called a nearest neighbor algorithm to form the clusters of the required size. So basically what you do is you start out by trying to find the most remote voting station in the entire district. And then you build a cluster with the 15 or 14 or 11 closest stations to that most remote one. Then you take that cluster out of consideration. You say, what's the next most remote station? And you just keep doing that, and you gradually kind of move in towards the more populated areas of the district. And then I used a routing machine. This is this project osrm.org to calculate optimal driving routes among the stations in each cluster. This was amazing to me that this could be done. I actually discovered it like the weekend. I was having problems with an earlier version of the clustering. I found that I could run this. It was pretty unbelievable. So it was able to do the 1,000 by 1,000 matrix to give me driving time, not just as the crow flies time, but actual estimates of driving time. And then once I would give it the 12 or 15 stations in the cluster, it would say what is the quickest route to drive among all of those, so that we could give to the observers not only a list of where they needed to go, but the order in which they could get to all the stations most effectively. Here's an example from Nelson Mandela Metro. So every number on here is a voting station in that metro, and the numbers are the clusters. So anything with the same number is in the same cluster, and this was just kind of a prototype version. But you can see, for example, 1 is up in the top right there, sort of in from Kuka. And there's a bunch of 1s. They're kind of overlapping with the 10, so it's hard to see. But that was cluster 1, because there was a station, and that was the most remote one from the rest of the stations. Then you can see number 2 jumps down here. It builds a cluster around 2. 3, 4, 5, it starts kind of circling in, and then we get to the heavily populated areas in town. And you can see in this kind of prototype 8, and I think it's 16, were the 2 clusters that we actually sampled. So had this not been a prototype, those would have been the stations that the teams would have gone to. But notice we had to cluster the entire Nelson Mandela Bay before we could actually do the selection. And you can see that, for example, a team that's doing cluster 8 is going to have an unusual experience that in going from one station to another in their cluster, they actually have to drive by a station that's not part of their cluster. And this is like completely, violates all their old ways of doing things. They would always be going kind of in a straight line and doing every station they come across. So that's the logic of the clustering. I had some problems when I was doing the early versions of this, and this is just one example of it. Before I had the routing machine, I was using as the crow flies distances, and this is rural Eastern Cape. You can see the dots. There's 15 dots. Each of them is a voting station. And if you look at the red dot, so the red dot is one of the ones that was sampled. And as the crow flies, it looks like it's quite close to the other ones. But if you can, I don't know how visible it is, if you see the terrain in between there, it's kind of mountainous, and then there's like a river that sort of goes around here. It turned out when I looked at Google Maps on this one, that it actually takes about 50 minutes to get from the black dots to the red one, because you had to go out to this road, up to the N2, and come all the way around, and then you would have to do the same thing to get back at the end. So this was what made me realize that when we do the clustering, we can't just do it on geographical distances as if everyone was in a helicopter. We actually could do it much more effectively if we know estimated driving time between each of the stations. What the teams would get would be something like this. This is just a spreadsheet. So for example, this is kind of spliced out of it. JHB 31 is one of the sampled Johannesburg clusters. You can see there's a route 1, 2, 3 to 15. Now you'll see the routes are actually circular, so we told them you don't have to start at number 1. You can start at whichever one is closest, but once you get to the closest station, then follow the route numbering after that. It's a metro district, province Gauteng, city of Johannesburg. You've got longitude, latitude things. You've got voting stations. I think one of them is called Tent, open space opposite Glenridge ShopRite. This is in Glenridge and Protea Glen in Soweto. So that's one of the clusters. So the team would be given these addresses and these routing instructions, and then they would go to those. And then each team would get something like that. The more detailed information on the clustering that we can get from the routing machine, these long numbers are just the codes for each of the voting stations. So for example, in the first row, we start at the one, go to the other. You can see an estimated duration of 3.4, that's in minutes, and a distance of 1.2 kilometers, that's it's in kilometers. Then the end for the first one becomes the start for the second, and so you just keep going on and on. You can see most of the distances are quite small, but we've got 2 that are about a half hour each out of the whole group. The other thing I mentioned about the clustering is the end for the last cluster is the beginning for the first cluster. So it's a circle. That's why you can start anywhere you want, and then you just keep following the route. The results, at least in terms of the implementing this, first, amazingly, we had no notable logistical problems. I nearly had a heart attack the night before the election because one of the teams told me that I had assigned them a station that was 3 hours from all their other stations. And I thought, oh my God, this whole thing might have got screwed up. It turned out that when they were looking at the spreadsheet, it was Free State. And so there were 15 rural and then 15 urban. And they had accidentally thought that one of the rural ones was part of their urban sample and that they were going to have to drive 3 hours to get there. But it turned out it was a mistake, and we explained it to them. I spent most of the weekend working on doing this for the Mozambican elections, which are coming up in a few weeks, which are going to be a lot more difficult because we don't have the quality of information about the location of the voting stations, and there are a lot of no-go areas for observers because of potential violence. Another reaction, we had some observers, especially the ones in the metro areas, complaining our cluster is not random. So they're used to being told, get a mix of urban and rural. And here we're telling them, go to Khayelitsha and do 15 voting stations that are literally within 400 meters of each other. So they're thinking, no, this isn't random. We had to explain to them, it's not that your cluster is random, it's that your cluster is part of a random sample. And so we're trying to get that through to them so they understand that. The third point, and this is where I think where you start to see the unconscious effects of not doing the sampling systematically in the past. We had during the debriefing, we had one of the observer teams. These aren't exactly direct quotes because I don't have a transcript, but basically one team that went to Puritichaba in rural Free State. The people were so excited when the observers arrived. They said, we've never seen observers here before. They had to drive 45 minutes from the closest B&B to get to Puritichaba. So you can imagine that the usual way of doing things, no one would have been going to Puritichaba. So this kind of gives you a sense of the biases that come in. The other one, Mahlapatini in KwaZulu-Natal, we actually had a team, they were based in Ulundi, and we randomly sampled them this cluster that was about 25, 30 kilometers outside of Ulundi, but still sort of part of the kingdom. And when they got there, the people were like, no, I think you've come to the wrong place. You know, all the politics is in Ulundi. You should go back there. And it gives you a sense of all the kinds of unconscious biases. For example, if they had been based in Ulundi and had just asked some locals, like, where should we go, they probably would have ended up doing a bunch of voting stations quite close to the King's Palace and vicinity. And we were actually telling them, no, drive 25, 30 kilometers outside and do it. And people didn't understand, like, why would you want to come here when there's more action in town? So that's, we can see, to me, that was evidence that, you know, these biases that we suspected exist actually do exist, and we're trying to improve the process going forward. But none of the clustering, I mean, it would be so difficult to be able to pull this off without the computing capacity and the kinds of data that we have now that we wouldn't have had 10, 20 years ago. Okay, and just, I mentioned that I would put a little bit of information up for people who are interested in the program. The easiest way to find information online is just www.escience.ac.za. That part at the end is just to get you specifically to the MA program in eScience as opposed to the other pages that are available, but you can find that. The one thing is, if you're looking for information, and also if you're going to apply online, make sure that you specify the MA program and not the MSc program if you've got a degree in the social sciences and humanities. There's course finder information on the faculty website, and then Casey Sparks is the administrator of this National eScience postgraduate teaching and training platform, which is the kind of bigger project that's funded by the Department of Science and Innovation. And there's a kind of generic email there for her as well if you have questions about, you know, how the